One of the updates I have is we're going to be getting a final quote this week on our insurance, and I should have that maybe by Tuesday or Wednesday next week, and I'll show that to the board members. It looks like we got a savings of maybe $100 to $200 in savings on next year's insurance, and with the same coverage. But before we approve that at next meeting, I'll show it to the board members. Okay, still waiting to hear back from Keith Hill, principal at Green Mountain High School, when I can meet with the students to ask for volunteers, not only for the Historical Society, but for the Alumni Association. So I'll have a chance to speak to the students fairly soon. No update on the alarm system at the Academy building yet. When we have our April meeting at the Academy building, starting that month, I'm going to be doing the plaster work in that room, because we've waited too long for that work to be done, and it doesn't seem to be getting done. So we're going to at least spruce up that one room, and we'll wait for the hallway and the other access areas. But our meeting room, we're going to get that up to snuff. Tonight's meeting is being recorded for SAPA TV by Susan Fairchild. Susan's one of our newest members and is going to help out with tech support for all our up-and-coming meetings, so we're grateful for that. Thank you, Susan. Tonight's guest speaker is Rachel Spafford. She's also our secretary, and looking forward to this. We don't have a big crowd here tonight. We didn't expect a big crowd. The weather turned on us. We got icy roads, so with that, I'm going to introduce Rachel. Thank you.
Good evening. So what I'm going to present to you today is based on my college thesis that I wrote back in 2007 about gravestone iconography, which is the symbolism that people use to portray an idea or a belief, or maybe provoke an emotion or an idea. So I focused on 3 of the cemeteries here in town. The Brookside Cemetery, which is the one on Main Street, right by the old Academy building, which is the town's first burial ground, started in the 1770s. And it was originally called the South Street Burial Ground. And the stones there are made out of slate, marble, granite, and then there's a few exceptions, such as from zinc and bronze. And then the second cemetery is the North Street Cemetery, right down the road from here. And that started in the 1820s. And that was probably originally used for people just who lived on the North Street. And then the third cemetery is the Pleasant View Cemetery, which is on High Street in the middle of town. And the town created that in 1875 after Brookside was running out of space. So these are the main types of stones used from the 17, 18, and 1900s. So the Industrial Revolution came around the 1820s, and that changed the way people lived their lives. Instead of producing everything by hand, there was factories and mass production by machines started. So the ability to produce the same thing in mass quantities affected which types of stones were used. Of American gravestones says grave markers have been made from slate, sandstone, marble, granite, limestone, schist, soapstone, and any other stone that was available. He goes on to say the type of stone used changed over time. In the late 1700s, it was mostly slate, and then it moved to white marble in the 1800s because of the railroad, and then to granite mostly in the 1900s. And that's what I saw in the three cemeteries that I looked at. Also, the other variety was zinc and bronze, which is on the lower right. And those were most common in the 1870s. And the process of covering the bronze with a pure zinc made the monument more able to withstand the time and weather. And then it was sandblasted to make it look more like stone. And then here's the Benjamin Park stone. So you can see it's very elaborate. It has a whole statue on top of it. Much different than most of the other smaller stones around it. So these are the three most common symbols in the 17 and 1800s. So the one on the upper left, I did not see any of because the skull is from the earlier 1700s, but I did see lots of the cherubs and sunny, smiling faces, and the willow and urn as well. During the Second Great Awakening in the late 17, early 1800s, the strict air of Puritanism was overtaken by a freer version of religion. The Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and the Baptists were the most affected groups, with revivals all around the country. This turn in religious belief into a happier outlook changed what kinds of symbols were used on the stones. So instead of the grim death's heads, people chose to use cherubs and more happy-looking faces. People no longer feared death's embrace, as evidenced by the flying angels and cherubs instead of the skeletons and the death's heads on the stones. The people of America were learning to accept death rather than fear it. Ministers and women began writing consolation literature in order to console those left behind and to give them hope for what was to come. In the early 1800s, people began being obsessed with remembering the dead, and the rural cemetery movement started up. The first example of this was Mount Auburn Cemetery in the Boston area. This movement created a new type of cemetery. So instead of the overcrowded burial grounds, it was replaced by garden cemeteries filled with trees and shrubs and flowers, and gravestones lined up in rows. These cemeteries were no longer just places for the dead, but also for the living to come and learn about their past in a relaxed setting. So the cemeteries were now a cultural institution, and the symbols on the stones spoke to those who weren't able to read the words, because of course a lot of people were still illiterate during the 1718, early 1900s. And this is how people passed down their ideas and values, from the grim death's heads of the Puritans to the cherubs and happy faces of the Baptists and Congregationalists, and then to the more secular willow and urn was there to console those left behind. These rural cemeteries displayed themes of mortality and eternity through the style of the stones. There were and are many monuments to the dead, which stand as a reminder to our past and creates a sense of patriotism that connects us with our ancestors and reminds us what price some of them had to pay for the freedom we now enjoy. The most popular style of these monuments from the late 17 and early 1800s, besides the traditional slate, were the sculpted marble pillar with the urn on top, which I have an example of coming up. And that was inspired by the Greek revival that was going on in the time in the architectural and sculptural world. And they also have some obelisks inspired by the Egyptians. And both of these are in these cemeteries here in town. And here are some other of the most common symbols found here in Chester and throughout the whole New England region. So some of them are the anchor, which might symbolize hope and a strong Christian faith. And as well, it could also be for a seafaring profession and potentially even a member of the Masons. And then there's also angels, and which symbolize resurrection and rebirth. And there's angel weeping, of course, is grief and mourning. There's lots of arches, wreaths, and garlands, which symbolizes victory over death. And of course, crosses also do. And a bird represents eternal life. Bouquets, drapes, flowers, and the urns and the willows usually signifies sorrow and mourning and remembrance. And flames symbolize life and truth. The candle, faith, and fruit, abundance, grapes, sacrifice. And actually, I saw one of a lamb, and that's innocence, of course, and sacrifice. And then one of the more common symbols as well is the Masonic compass and set square, which is a symbol of creation and spirit, as well as lawfulness and judgment, and the union of sky and earth. And there was lots of open Bibles and books, which usually represented a deceased teacher or minister. And there's lots of scrolls too, like the middle and right picture. And deer as well represents life, wisdom, and regeneration and growth. And trees also represent life. So there was quite a few fraternal and military orders and organizations that left their marks on the stones as well. These are some of the more common ones. There was also the Rebekahs and the Order of the Eastern Star as well, and the American Legion. So the Masons, again, that's the most common symbol, of course, is the compass in the square with a G in the middle, which represents God, geometry, and geomancy. And then the Odd Fellows are represented by the 3 rings, which stands for friendship, love, and truth. And the Patrons of Husbandry, which is also the Grange, that's sort of the Grange Hall, that's represented by the bundle of wheat. And then one of the military organizations, GAR, which is the Grand Army of the Republic, and that was originally a Civil War organization founded in 1866, but it also carried on through the other wars, through the Korean War, so through 1956. And here's more military graves. So the Department of Veterans Affairs is required to provide markers for deceased soldiers if they ask. And they usually don't provide markers for pre-World War I vets unless there's written evidence of service. They do, however, offer a special Civil War marker made of marble or granite with a sunken shield with a soldier's name and abbreviated military organization in it. So they usually have either flat markers made of granite or marble or bronze, as you see in these pictures, or they have the upright granite and marble. And there's some exceptions. They have other, like some of them have pillars or obelisks or more rustic style as well. And as you usually see an American flag, of course, by a military gravestone. So some of these, the upper left is from the Revolutionary War, and that's actually right by the Baptist church in the Brookside Cemetery. And there's some World War I, World War II, Korea. And here's some more. Of course, the big Civil War monument out in the front of the Brookside Cemetery. You can see the examples of the American flags also by the stones. And the flags also have metal, either round or star-shaped, that says the name of the war and the years, as like in the examples, Korea, and I even found one, the lower right picture, War of 1812, which I thought was pretty neat because you don't usually see that one. Here's another interesting thing I found on a slate stone in Brookside Cemetery. This is a stone cutter's advertisement. So it says, made by Moses Wright of Rockingham, price $17. So I thought that was pretty cool, he put that in there.
Yeah.
So the Wright family of Rockingham carved many of the stones here in Chester, especially the slate ones in the Brookside Cemetery. And Moses Wright he came to Rockingham as one of the first settlers in the early 1700s and was Rockingham's town clerk in 1761. So when slate stopped being used around 1840, it was replaced by marble. The art of stone carving virtually stopped. Although there are marble stones with carving on them, it is rare because marble isn't as carvable as slate is. So most of the more fancy, elaborate designs are on the slate stones. And then when granite took over in the 1900s, people usually opted for simpler stones, so they didn't really have too much design on them. And today's stone cutters rely mainly on machines and computers to design the stones. So here's an example of a machine cut stone. So it's really more etched instead of carved into the stone. But of course, obviously they can still do very elaborate, fancy images. So, which is still pros and cons to both, you know, hand carving and machine made. Here's another interesting stone in the Brookside Cemetery. This is Miss Elizabeth Olcott, which apparently was the second female who came to town. And it actually says it right on her stone at the bottom. You can see part of it. So and also another interesting thing about this stone is the word consort, which is a word that they use instead of wife. It means the same thing. And she actually lived till she was 82, which is not bad for 1800.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting thing I found, and actually first the picture on the left is an example of the Greek revival style of the marble pillar with the urn on top. Also, if you see the little oval on that one, and then on the left, on the right, there's a rectangular place where a picture was actually put of the deceased. And I actually just looked it up to verify that, yes, they did have some form of camera in the mid-1800s, so. But who knows how long the picture actually lasted for, of course. But the place they carved in the stone for it still remains. So. And this is from the mid-1850s. So now we're going to move on to the words and how they change over time. So the inscriptions themselves have gone through several changes, such as what words were used for wife, like the consort, and the years of death, and what they decided to put on the stones themselves. And also in the late 1700s, they had the long S, that looks like an F. We use that quite often too. So in the early 1700s, many stones began with something like, "Here lies the body of," which we don't have here because all our cemeteries are late 1700s onwards. But we see here is, like on the left, "In memory of." There was lots of those in the late 17 and all throughout the 1800s. And then some stones, of course, just like the right picture, only had the name of the deceased and their birth and death dates and the age. So the last thing I want to talk about is epitaphs. So many stones starting in the second half of the 1700s included epitaphs, which were mostly, according to Farber, conventional, traditional, and repetitive, but were still worth reading, because even the most banal speaks to us about the beliefs and tenor of the times. From them we learn of the prevailing religious beliefs, of the levels of education and health, of politics and war, of daily life and occupations, of the relative status of the sexes, and much more. Sprinkled among the commonplace and the conventional, one finds sparkling treasures conveying both profound philosophy and poignant expressions of love and grief. Farber goes on to say that there are 3 voices used in the epitaphs: the deceased themselves, the family member or friend, or a philosopher's voice. So one of the most common ones found in the 1700s is the one on the stone, which you can just barely make out, but it said, it's a more Puritan, grim view of death, and it says, "Death is a debt to nature due. I have paid it, and so must you." That's what it says on this stone, which is from 1795, a 17-year-old. And then another example of a younger child's grave, what they said in the epitaph, was written by the parents' voice, and that was of Lorenza Sawyer. And it says, "Sleep on, sweet child, and take thy rest. God called thee home, who thought it best." There's quite a few children's graves in the Brookside Cemetery as well. And then another one of the most common epitaphs in the late 17, early 1800s was, "Stranger, behold, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. So I am now, you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." So in conclusion, by studying New England's graveyards, we can see what life was like for those who came before us and learn from them what and how they thought about the afterlife and of life in general. So from the early Puritans, more austere view of the world, to the Congregationalist and Baptist brighter outlook, to the more secular scientific view. All of these things can be seen through the stones and the symbols that they chose to use. So that ends the presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. The question for Rachel is, you've done extensive research on this, obviously, and that came about because
Yeah.
it was, could you tell them how this came about?
So this is my thesis project again in college. So there's several months worth of research and putting it all together. And I got that was for my BA in anthropology, concentration archaeology, and I minored in history. So that's what that was for.
Yeah. And you went to school where?
And that was in Franklin Pierce over in Rindge, New Hampshire, back in 2007.
Well, that was quite a presentation. Any questions for Rachel tonight? Okay. Is there any questions for me or the Historical Society? Or, you know, we're going to meet in March, obviously. We don't have a topic for March yet or a guest speaker. We do for April, but so if anybody has any ideas for the month of March, we will meet here, you know, for our meeting. But I know it was tough. It was a small crowd here tonight, and it was tough weather for people to get out. We are on TV. I'm going to ask Susan that we close this meeting now, and I'm going to ask that this meeting comes to adjourn, and then we can gather around and visit after. So a motion to adjourn? And seconded? Okay. Thank you, everyone. questions, a short meeting?
If, has there been any sort of either inventory or some way that someone has taken an image or rubbed an image or somehow recorded all of these stones that are in our cemeteries? Is there a listing somewhere?
Well, I don't know about the Chester stones, but Rutland County has an enormous, probably one of the largest collections in New England of rubbings. And if you're interested, I could bring some of those. Professor Elsa from Castleton College.
You know, Ken used to be the cemetery sexton, do you know?
Yeah.
Right.
Ken, do you know that anybody that it's done rubbings on Chester stones? Or Ken was our cemetery sexton for what, 39 years? Yeah.
He actually gave me some of my information.
Ron Patch and his son started to do an inventory of the Main Street Cemetery, and they got it about half done. I don't know if he's gonna continue or not.
Just recall, like, when I was in high school and I went there, you could still really read all of the epitaphs on them.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
noticed in the last few years when I brought the children with me to show them, a lot of the stones are either sinking into the earth and the epitaph is disappearing,
Right.
or the stone itself is degrading so that it's very difficult to read some of them now. So I wondered if someone took pictures of everyone like 40 years ago.
Right, you would hope so.
Rubbed them with a crayon.
Well, I can check and have something for you maybe next meeting, or what's going on with that, or,
And isn't it the Tom that we're gonna have in April is gonna talk about
Yes.
preservation
Yeah.
for cemeteries?
yeah, our
So-
April speaker is Tom Giffen. And,
It hasn't been done yet. It might be something that.
Right.
Yeah,
When you
we
talk to
can
the
do.
high school kids
Yeah.
and they're.
I did the town grand over the years ago, back in the eighties. And it's an enormous project, but just for one cemetery, like Brookside, would take a long time. It's really
Did
almost
you rub
a
them?
small group of people, rubbing, but just, I went around and got all the inscriptions, all the information,
Oh, you wrote it down?
you know.
Oh, wow.
Because I had about books and envelopes, but I've never been doing trust none of those.
And Ken, just like the town of Chester have a book, like Brookside Cemetery book, and it's got right in the beginning everybody that's buried in there, or no?
Unfortunately not.
It would be a good
That's
project.
what Ron and his son started to do.